Hello and welcome to Insight for a deeper look inside the issues that shape our world. Today we will be discussing smart power and the NGO complex. I'm joined in studio today by Vanessa Beeley. She's a writer, a researcher, and a peace activist, and a member of the Syria Solidarity Movement. Yesterday's military power and colonial instruments of control have been replaced by what some might call soft or smart power, run through a global multi-billion-dollar NGO and charity industry, and supported by a slick media marketing machine. I'll begin with a quote from Stephanie McMillan, former NGO worker. Along with military invasions and missionaries, NGOs help crack countries open like ripe nuts, paving the way for intensifying waves of exploitation and extraction. That's Stephanie McMillan. Welcome to Insight, Vanessa.
Thank you.
And we're going to discuss the NGO complex. We're going to discuss smart power today. And one of the things that I want to get in depth today is from your experience. I know this is an area that you've really developed research in and a really intense study. And also your work at 21st Century Wire has coalesced somewhat with things that I've done and researched as well in this subject, and this is very relevant today with what's going on geopolitically in the world. So if you'd like to just give us an introduction of what we're looking at here.
Sure. Basically we're looking at, Stephanie McMillan describes it perfectly actually in that quote. The NGO complex is really a continuation of the missionary process, the subjugation of the global south by the global north, the selling or the marketing of the perception that the global north is everything that imbues democracy, civilization, education, development, evolution of humanity. Everything in the global north, the post-colonial global north, represents, according to these entities, everything that is corrupt, everything that is dishonest, everything that is primitive, everything that is not civilized, in contrast to the global north, and therefore is in need of development, aid for evolution, which is just another terminology for subjugation, another terminology for infiltration, and for co-opting these cultures and these societies into the imperialist vision or the neo-colonialist vision for their future and for our future. In other words, now the NGO complex is used as an interface between the military, the economic, the political powers, and the prey nations, as I call them, the target nations for that neo-colonialist attack.
And we're going to get into depth in how this works. We're going to look at how this is sold in the West, how consensus is built, and how they can get the public behind any number of humanitarian interventions and actual military interventions as well. So I think you've got some images for us, and we want to kind of get started and run through.
This is a perfect example, this quote from an Ottawa chief who lived between 1718 and 1769. They came with the Bible and their religion, they stole our land, crushed our spirit, and now they tell us we should be thankful to the Lord for being saved. As I said, that has now been transferred. We should be thankful for democracy, fundamentally, civilization. If we look at a very early example of this neo-colonialist practice of infiltrating a society, and where we can see very much the new NGOs as agents of change utilize the process of the 3 Ps, as we call it: power, psychology, and persistence. Power is to basically infiltrate a society, target those who are in power and have influence and can facilitate any sort of change process. Psychology is using intelligence to discover the processes that community community adheres to, discovering those who have influence within that, just really working out the psychology of that entire culture in order to be able to influence it from the inside. Then if we look at persistence, this is basically persisting with that process. In other words, not allowing a target culture to regroup or to reform or to decide that actually they don't want to be pushed down one particular route. If we look at what the NGOs do now and compare it to what, for instance, happened in Palestine during
we've got an image here.
Yeah, this is an image of taken from Nakba, the Israeli ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948. What many people are not aware of is that a British general, Ord Wingate, was actually involved in the training of the Haganah, the Israeli attack forces, and he was responsible for the surveillance, for basically both the aerial and on-the-ground surveillance of these villages, these Palestinian villages and towns, in order to determine exactly that. Who was in power, who were the influential families, religious leaders, imams in these communities, so that when the Haganah went in, basically they'd cracked that nut. As Stephanie puts it, they'd absolutely cracked that nut. They knew exactly who to target in order to reduce the security of those communities and drive them out more easily. And if we actually look at what has happened since Iraq, for instance, the war against Iraq, people are now much more aware of these military processes, and they're going to protest them. So what we've now seen is a diversion from this military tactic into the NGO complex, and the NGO complex, in my opinion, is now used as the military was originally used, as scouts, as spies, as outreach agents, as intel agents, to get into these cultures and determine the weak points, the strong points, the complementary forces that can work towards the Western agenda.
And how the church was used in the past by empires as an intelligence gathering operation, and to infiltrate communities and do the 3Ps, which you said before, so a wolf in sheep's clothing. So tell us a little bit about the process of gaslighting.
Gaslighting is something, it's a very interesting process. It comes from a 1940s film. But it's now been developed as a psychological process, and it's used by many of the intelligence agencies, the CIA included, as a torture technique. It's a process by which somebody's ability to trust in their own perception of their environment and of various situations is undermined. It's eroded gradually over time through various mental torture processes. So the abuser basically manipulates the victim to a state where they no longer have any trust in their own judgment. They lose their own self-identity, and they end up relying upon their abuser to replace their reality. And this is very much what we see happening with the various processes that the government uses, that the state uses, to persuade us of a power of good. The NGOs are part of that process. In other words, the media and the NGOs work in lockstep to present cases, perceptions to us. Once our own ability to judge a situation has been reduced by the fear factor, for example, the fear of terror, the fear of financial insecurity, the fear of loss of our own stability. Many bogeymen are thrown at us to put us into this position of insecurity, and then that insecurity is replaced by a reassuring reality by our governments, who do it through the media, through cinema, through the NGOs. The NGOs is that power for good that we cling on to when our security has been eroded.
So I look at this in terms of as far as what you just described with gaslighting, to soften up the West, to soften up the electorate, the constituency, I guess, in North America or Europe, in order to create a consensus, maybe to get behind some sort of a campaign for a no-fly zone or a humanitarian intervention that's softening up the West. And then there's also the softening up of the target nation. And this is done through destabilization, which we outlined before. So where do we go from here?
I think from here we go to if we have a look at the NPIC complex, the not-for-profit industrial complex, we see how, in fact, this entire complex is a very, very tightly knit, closed-loop money laundering process. You have the state or the government at the top, which then interconnects with the ruling classes, who then, the process goes like this. They basically form their foundations, whether it's the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Clinton Foundation. Those foundations in turn produce NGOs, and it's the NGOs that elicit public donations, public monies, and then we can see how very easy it is to sort of launder that money around the process so that eventually it goes back into the foundations, it goes back to the ruling class, and it goes back to the state. So this is very much a closed, it's a front for fraud.
In a domestic setting, we might call this the third sector, or we might call this the non-governmental sector, and this is very active in North America, in Europe, but especially internationally. So in the Middle East, in Africa, in conflict zones, we have thousands of NGOs.
Yeah, and it's the graveyard for social movements, basically, because it's co-opting them. It's taking them into, I call it almost like it's a mafia protection racket. In other words, if you buy into this protection, whether it's the target nations, whether it's domestic communities, you're buying into a protection racket, you're buying into this, and that money is then fed back to the mafia, the heads of the mafia.
So this is really performing a role. It's creating a kind of a parallel society. Yeah. It's kind of a shadow state.
Absolutely.
But it's also done through, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but this is done through what some might call the tyranny of good intentions, by co-opting celebrity to sponsor various human rights campaigns. Human rights charities like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, big names. These are big brands.
Absolutely.
But they're being used as a kind of a tool, in a way, to maybe back up U.S. foreign policy, as an example. Whatever the State Department's doing, Amnesty International is pushing in the same direction, or Human Rights Watch is pushing in the same direction.
These NGOs will never swim against the crony capitalist stream. That's for sure. The ruling parasites are never going to produce an organization or a complex that is going to actually damage its interests, that's actually going to undermine its interests. And in fact, what you will see is the NGO complex acting hostilely towards those organizations or those grassroots movements that threaten any sort of crony capitalist agenda in the region.
And I think it's important to qualify that we are talking about the high-profile charities, the high-profile NGOs. This is a multi-billion-dollar global industry. But there are a lot of NGOs, independent NGOs, doing great work. The majority of people, in my opinion, I don't know if you agree with me, but they're well-intentioned, hard-working, good people who want to do good work, who want to make a difference in the world, and doing whatever they can, mobilizing their skills, their education to help people who are less fortunate. This is the majority of people, I believe, that get into this sector. However, when you go to the top layer and you see what is going on up there, and the collusion between Western interventionist, neo-colonial foreign policy, corporate agendas, softening up markets for future infiltration by cartels of corporations, which we saw in places like Iraq and throughout the world. That's very different than the person leaving college who wants to go and volunteer or work for an NGO on the ground, and who wants to do so with the best of intentions. So I think it's very important right now to zero in on probably what might be the biggest case study for what we're talking about with the NGO, with the Smart Power Complex. So we're going to talk this activity going on and is really acting kind of as a proxy or a covert function for Western objectives in the region. So this is a quote from Professor Abu Khalil. He said, "Syria is one of the biggest propaganda schemes of our time. When the dust settles, if it does, it will be revealed." Professor Abu Khalil. The scale of what is going on in Syria is immense, and the NGO smart power deception is all out with Syria.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, the war against Syria is probably the dirtiest war in history, and at the base of that is this, as you say, this massive apparatus, this lethal humanitarian complex, this NGO complex that has been arrayed against Syria, and that we're back to the 3Ps, the persistence. Keep at it, keep producing new NGOs, and we've seen right from the beginning of this war against Syria a series of propaganda attempts by the neo-colonialist nations that are targeting Syria, which the US, NATO, the Gulf states, Israel. The underlying desire on their part has always been the no-fly zone, because we know that this will basically ultimately lead to the destruction of Syria on the same scale as Libya and result in it being a failed state.
In Iraq too, was a no-fly zone was established.
Absolutely.
So we've got an image of President Obama. What are we looking at here?
Basically, this was one of the early no-fly zone petitions raised by Avaz, and we'll be talking about them shortly. Again, it's this use of imagery that these NGOs are using, run by often or backed by massive multi-million marketing companies. These NGOs elicit our empathy, draw out our sympathy in order to persuade our perception, and they do it through these very evocative images that are deliberately created to persuade us to go down one particular route. It's the nudging process. We're used to this from British intelligence, and this is very much what they use. This has been produced by the White Helmets. We'll be talking about them shortly, but another NGO on the ground in Syria. And again, these images are very, very, very staged. They're very evocative. They're very advertising campaign.
This is perfect.
Absolutely perfect.
This is absolutely perfect. This image. So they're selling an idea here. They're selling a feeling. They're selling support for this NGO, in particular, it's the White Helmet. So we'll break them down in detail in a minute. And then moving on here, now this word we see a lot, especially since Barack Obama became president in 2008, is the word change.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we see it if you look into third sector recruitment advertising. We're looking for agents of change. Be an agent of change. Change. This is a term we're getting used to.
Climate change, regime change. Change is this word that it's the buzzword. It's the word. The problem is that we're told everything needs to change. And yes, we're told they need everyone, and that is correct. They do need everyone. So that is why we must never underestimate the sheer power of this apparatus that is driving for this change. But does anybody ever actually pause to ask, well, okay, change to what? It's very rare that we're actually given a concrete description of what this change entails or what it's going to actually need from us. It's just that everybody, they're put into, again, we're almost back to the gaslighting. We're put into a situation where so many of our abilities are reduced, are pushed down, so that we sort of cease to question. We're just desperate to find a way out of whatever situation has been imposed upon us. And so therefore, the idea of change becomes very attractive. And we actually, to some extent, we've been conditioned to give away that power of questioning and that power of doubt. And we sort of accept, we follow down this route because everyone's doing it. And it becomes a buzzword, very, very clever marketing machine that's behind this.
When you if you want to break gaslighting down to its component parts, gaslighting is really a description of, it's a phenomenon which is something that comes out of applied behavioral psychology.
Yeah.
So if you break this down into neurolinguistic programming, what a word like change is I throw out change, and then it's a powerful word. It means a lot. It's from an NLP point of view, it's one of the diamonds. People will then project what their idea of change is. So you can get up as a politician or as an NGO head or head of a charity and say, we want to be agents of change, and the crowd will then project what their idea of change is, and no specifics will ever be given. And I think a lot of politicians, most notably Obama, have used this to masterfully in their political careers.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, basically, if we actually do start to question it, we realize that actually the unity that they are imposing upon us is conformity with the general consensus. But that general consensus does not come from us, it comes from above. It's just that we, as you quite rightly say, we're sort of fooled into believing that we're a part of it, that we're a part of that process. And war is peace, of course, because the NGO complex works in lockstep with the military-industrial complex. In fact, the military-industrial complex, to a huge extent, these days cannot function without that forerunning of the NGO complex.
And we've got this image here. It's kind of a Russian constructivist, kind of a pastiche of this, what you're talking about here.
Absolutely. This was actually created by Corey Morningstar. And anybody who wants to read up on the NGO complex, particularly from the point of view of Agenda 21, climate change, please go to Corey's The Wrong Kind of Green.
So, moving on from here, we have a number of organizations. These range from charities to the United Nations itself, and then a number of NGOs and NGO marketing, or what we call social entrepreneur companies. This is a whole new class of businesses, we're told, but they're really in the business, again, the change business, and the revolution business, the color revolution business. So let's look at some of these organizations here. Who have we got in that matrix here?
Yeah, I mean, if we look, these are just a few, very few, of the organizations that are working against Syria and producing anti-Syria propaganda on an almost daily basis. And we've included organizations, intelligence organizations like the CIA, like the MI5 in there, because actually what we're now seeing and what Syria is revealing or exposing to a huge extent is that the deep state is coming to the surface and it's becoming more prevalent in its predatory, this is predatory humanitarianism that we're seeing here, that's being used against Syria. And as I say, this is only a very small percentage of the number of the hundreds of NGOs that are working on the ground in Syria to produce the propaganda that serves the neo-colonialist agenda.
Hundreds of NGOs.
Literally hundreds.
Just on a side note, in Gaza, there's over 1,000 NGOs.
Yeah, I mean,
right
Palestine is a very good case study. In fact, if we look at what is called the post-Oslo boom in NGOs, from 1995 to 2005, the number of NGOs in Palestine grew from about 500 to around 1,400, and I would surmise on that level of growth that by now we'd be at around 2,000 NGOs operating on the ground in Palestine, governing or monopolizing agriculture, health, and education. So they have an enormous power base within Palestine, funded by Western donors, backers, government organizations. So hugely co-opting the resistance movement. They were originally, that boom happened to prevent and stultify any resistance to the Oslo Agreement. And then, quite possibly, they've seen how successful that whole process was. And so they've grown that entire complex exponentially. Plus, with the financial crisis in Palestine, many resistance movements could not self-fund. So what they did was actually apply to become an NGO and to then receive Western funding, which then immediately mollifies that resistance movement. And actually, I have a very interesting story. When I was in Beirut, I met a Jordan-based NGO that was replanting trees in West Bank. And they told me, they said that USAID, the United States Aid Development Agency, had knocked on their door numerous times to basically offer funding. And at the last visit, they'd offered them 50,000, basically in cash. They just put it on the table. And they refused it. Within 1 week of that refusal, they'd been under attack from Israeli soldiers, direct attack, which they had not had before. So one could say that's coincidental. One could say that's purely because they refused to join
the racket,
the matrix.
the protection
Yeah,
racket.
absolutely. They didn't accept the mafia protection offer.
Well, this strikes me, Vanessa, as a very inexpensive way. And if you look at it from a cost point of view, rather than sort of invading and occupying a nation, this is a very inexpensive way to construct a shadow state within a state, or within a destabilized would-be state, like Palestine as an example, or in Aleppo, or in places like that are in parts of Lebanon and in Africa. So a shadow state, so this is taking over every aspect of society, every service, the education sector, right?
Monopolizing it.
Education,
bringing it under control.
Healthcare, and the list goes on. And so what do you have there? A prosthetic that's growing inside a society.
And it's a complete co-opting and monitoring and surveillance of the grassroots resistance movement, and it's a complete undermining and weakening of it.
Trojan horse, you could call it. There's another term we could use. So the one of the main organizations, which a lot of people who are familiar with this topic might know, is USAID. And USAID, it's kind of out, the cat's out of the bag with regards to this organization. It's very well documented. It's acting as a front organization in many cases for U.S. intelligence, but openly giving money and buying influence in countries, and can be used in two ways. From what I've researched with USAID, they'll spread the money around in order to buy favor of maybe the middle class, maybe the business class, handing out contracts. So that's part of it. The other thing is directly funding NGOs that are masquerading as NGOs but are really working to undermine a country like Syria, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're there. They were set up in 1961 as an outreach agent for the CIA. As you quite rightly say, funding far-right extremist terrorist groups, anything that will serve the United States agenda in a target nation.
So, USAID, and this is a quote here from Daddy Cherry. I believe she's from Haiti.
She's Haitian,
She's Haitian, and she says, Haiti is a laboratory. USAID, the World Bank, and the UN have grown fat on Haiti. That's no exaggeration.
No, absolutely not. In fact, I was just reading, as I said, a conversation between Charles Ortel, a financial analyst, and Daddy Cherry, and he's investigating the Clinton Foundation that has basically, embezzled billions of public donations that should have gone to help Haiti after the earthquake. And so this will be an interesting one to follow through on.
And we'll shift gears a little bit now. I want to talk about war, okay? Because smart power is become more and more important in paving the way for military interventions or humanitarian interventions, or whatever they're going to call it. And if you look back at the Iraq War, and we've got an image here of Colin Powell, former U.S. General Colin Powell, former U.S. Secretary of State during the George administration in the United States, and before these politicians or cabinet members were tasked with selling the war, and in Iraq it was a really hard sell, but essentially it was the same thing as what we're seeing today. It was just sort of packaged differently. We have Colin Powell holding up a vial of talcum powder in the UN and insisting that this is anthrax and that we must act. So this is the beginning of the responsibility to protect, which the humanitarians or the smart power class will call R2P. We have a responsibility as part of the global north, as the former colonial rightful rulers of the planet, to act. We have the responsibility to protect these people who are in danger of being besieged by weapons of mass destruction. In the case of Iraq, history shows now this was a complete lie. The dossier was dodgy, and it doesn't matter what reports and inquiries are done by government, its history has already been written. They lied. They lied about chemical weapons, and they tried it once again in Syria in August 2013. Almost an identical sort of fictional scenario was created for the Assad regime, as they refer to in Syria, as launching a chemical weapons attack against its own people, and we were really a hair from declaring war, Britain and the U.S., and bombing Syria in 2013 into the Stone Age. That was delayed, and but it's the same patterns repeating itself.
And we're also seeing it in Yemen. If we look at the way that USA, for example, the UN and Saudi Arabia are working in lockstep to really collectively punish the Yemeni people for demanding their own sovereignty, for demanding their right to their self-determination. If we look at when Saudi Arabia started the bombing in Yemen in March 2015, in June 2015, USA deliberately turned off the aid to Yemen. At the same time, Saudi Arabia created the King Salman Center, the first humanitarian NGO, oxymoron in that one, and USAID endorsed the King Salman Center almost immediately. So did the UN, in order to basically, completely decimate Yemen, using US-supplied illegal cluster munitions against civilian targets. The UN itself has, again, as it did in Iraq, used its own UN Resolution 2216, based upon the legitimacy of an illegitimate President Hadi in Yemen, which was an embargo, which called for an embargo against 5 named individuals, but has been used by and exploited by Saudi Arabia to collectively starve 27 million Yemenis with a land, air, and sea blockade. So there we're seeing, USAID, NGO, the UN, the ultimate NGO, if you like, or the ultimate global peace bringer, in theory, working with an absolute monarchy with one of the worst human rights violations records globally, collectively punishing, waging a war of aggression against a sovereign nation. So there we see this absolute travesty of humanitarian help for a country.
And we saw the WikiLeaks cables in 2015 that there was a kind of quid pro quo support between the UK delegation and Saudi Arabia, both wanting to get onto the UN Human Rights Council, both nominating each other. This was revealed through these leaks, so there's collusion there. And also, Saudi Arabia, $1 million donation to the United Nations or to the UNHRC.
Yeah.
I believe, right before their appointment as head of the organization.
Well, there was also the vote exchange between, the alleged vote exchange between Britain
and Saudi Arabia. So that's very interesting. So Saudi Arabia is literally buying its way into the smart power complex, like directly.
Yeah, absolutely.
As a government, as an autocracy.
So they can carry out crimes against humanity under the guise of humanitarianism, which is exactly, it's what we're seeing globally. The use of the humanitarian NGO complex as a lethal weapon.
And so this is what I would call, and this is a new term that I think has been born in our book anyway, I call it geopolitically correct.
Yeah.
This is taking political correctness to another level. We've got an image here of President Barack Obama, and this is the newly crowned King Salman in Saudi Arabia. And so these are best of friends, without a doubt, but the geopolitical correctness is because Saudi Arabia is greasing the palms of the UN with cash, because Saudi Arabia is spreading its money around to U.S. senators and NGOs and foundations linked to them, like John McCain linked foundation, received $1 million from Saudi
the
Arabia.
military-industrial complex in the case of Yemen has received $33 billion since the start of the conflict.
Just over 12 months.
Yeah.
$33 billion in arms sales, almost exclusively, by the way, from U.S. and U.K.
No, that's exclusively U.S.
Exclusively
yeah,
U.S.
the U.K. is $7 billion.
$7 billion. So from those two countries, money going to purchase weapons, basically being used against the people of Yemen, ostensibly.
Yeah.
So geopolitically correct. So this governs geopolitics right now. So what matters is who's giving what to whom. So what's happening in Yemen, maybe some of the most egregious human rights violations that we've seen openly. Now, it's one thing when we talk about Syria, this is happening through proxies, through guerrilla forces that are being backed, armed by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, by the United States, by the CIA, maybe by the British too, I would imagine, and Turkey, facilitated by Turkey. Okay, that is one thing. This is the dirty war. It's covert. What's happening in Yemen, the use of cluster bombs, for instance, by Saudi Arabia's Air Force. This is a state doing this openly against its neighbor. This is a very different proposition altogether. So we've got an image here. This is a cluster bomb. These are leftover, actually, from what Israel dropped in South Lebanon, millions of cluster bombs, but these same type of weapons are being used in a big way in Yemen. And this is a violation of human rights. This is against Geneva Conventions.
It's against Geneva Conventions. It's against the cluster munitions conventions. Of course, the United States is not a signatory of this convention. However, its export law states very clearly that these munitions should never be used against civilian targets, and they should have, which is sort of pretty disgusting still, they should have a less than 1% failure rate, which means that basically the bomblets that are released by the cluster munition when it explodes mid-air should explode upon impact. But we know that Saudi Arabia has been using these cluster munitions exclusively against civilian targets or even humanitarian convoys, as it did last year. So while the United States is not a signatory of the Cluster Munitions Convention, Saudi Arabia is still flouting the US's own export laws, and yet the US has continued supplying them. And we also know that the US and the UK are present in the Riyadh Command and Control Centres, although they claim they have no say in the actual targets that are chosen. You know, this is kind of very difficult to believe if they're stood there determining where those missiles are sent, and yet they can then just sort of wash their hands of responsibility. They must see where those missiles are being deployed, and it is against civilian targets.
And the U.S. are involved in air refueling.
Yeah.
The U.S. are, from their base in Bahrain, they are very much involved in the air campaign, the bombing campaign against Yemen, and also engineering, technical support. Because when the U.S. sells its hardware to countries, countries don't just get the hardware; they get the expertise.
Absolutely. Well, Lockheed Martin, don't forget, has just set up their first external to the U.S. Base or factory inside Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised. So yes.
And that doesn't get publicized a lot.
No.
It doesn't. So when they buy the kit, when Israel purchased the Iron Dome system, U.S. military officers are running that system in Israel. So I think a lot of people aren't aware of how the whole package works in terms of arms sales. So let's look at some of the main players here. Who are the main players behind the NGO and smart power complex? You need money to run this globally, to run the shadow state, this big society, this big international society. you need money, and one of the gentlemen is George Soros. He's a Wall Street billionaire. I believe he's Hungarian in origin. He's got a very colorful history, but he spends a lot of money through the Open Society Institute, through a series of foundations. We've got some of them here. Just explain to us what we're looking at here, these balls that are being juggled by George Soros.
Yeah, the war porn wizard. Well, basically, yes, George Soros and USAID are the main funders behind the NGO complex that is operating inside Syria. And these, again, are really just a percentage of the NGOs that Soros is funding.
So we've got Amnesty International, we've got Purpose, we've got Doctors of Our World, Médecins Sans Frontières.
Médecins Sans Frontières, Insan, Wissam Tarif, who was originally one of VAR's campaign managers. You have Amnesty International, Médecins Sans Frontières, Medics Under Fire, Syria Campaign, Planet Syria, all of these offshoots from these various NGOs, and of course the White Helmets.
And so moving on from here, now we're just going to show this as an example. Human Rights Watch has a really great profile, especially in Hollywood. A lot of celebrities support Human Rights Watch, and in the past year it's been interesting. The head of Human Rights Watch, his name is Ken Roth. He's been what he's been saying in public, it's almost completely in lockstep, streamlined with what is coming out of the State Department. So with regards to Syria, Ken Roth, we have an example here, unfortunately has been caught on multiple occasions tweeting fake photographs. This is the head of one of the biggest, most high-profile human rights charities in the world, is routinely putting out fake images, misrepresenting the conflict in Syria in order to clearly demonize the government in Damascus, which is exactly what the State Department is doing. He seems to be somehow completely synchronized with what the State Department is doing. There's a revolving door between the U.S. government and some of these organizations, which will show
one of the directors, of course, of HRW is a former CIA director. And so there is a very clear revolving door. Another director is Solana, who was one of the war criminals from Kosovo, of course. So
General Solana, from NATO.
So the board itself is questionable. The funding is certainly questionable. It had seed funding, massive seed funding from George Soros, to enable it to exponentially grow its global influence. And then, of course, it had funding.
And